Few fights can match the ferocity of the fighting that occurred just outside the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland on the morning of September 17th, 1862. We pick up a history book or watch a documentary and hear primarily about the Texans in the cornfield or the Irish Brigade in the sunken road. But on the west side of the Hagerstown Turnpike near the famed cornfield, some of the deadliest and tallest fighting took place. In this video, we will cover the short but intense fight between Starke's Louisiana Brigade and Jackson's Brigade of Virginians and Alabamians against their federal adversaries. We will explore the men of those brigades and try to understand what they went through to the best of our historical abilities, along with analyzing the events leading up to this moment in history. In the fall of 1862, Starke's brigade was composed of 5 regiments and 1 battalion, all being from Louisiana. According to Ezra Carman, Antietam veteran and the chief authority on the battle, Starke's brigade had 650 men during the battle. Starke's brigade was commanded by 47-year-old Virginia-born William Edwin Starke. Before the war, Starke had found his wealth in the cotton industry in Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1861, he was commissioned lieutenant colonel of the 53rd Virginia Infantry, and by the end of 1861, Starke was made colonel of the 60th Virginia Infantry. Starke was known to be a natural-born leader, with General A.P. Hill praising him for conspicuous gallantry during the 7 Days battle. As a reward of his outstanding leadership, he was made commander of the newly formed 2nd Louisiana Brigade in July of 1862. During the Battle of Antietam and Maryland campaign, the brigade consisted of the 1st Louisiana Infantry Regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Nolan, the 2nd Louisiana Regiment commanded by Colonel Jesse M. Williams, the 9th Louisiana Regiment commanded by Colonel Leroy A. Stafford, the 10th Louisiana Regiment commanded by Captain Henry D. Monier, the 15th Louisiana Regiment commanded by Colonel Edmund Pendleton, and the 1st Louisiana Zouaves Infantry Battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Marie Alfred Coppins. Jackson's brigade, often labeled as Taliaferro's brigade, was commanded by 2 men leading up to the Battle of Antietam. After General William B. Taliaferro was wounded at the Battle of Second Manassas, Colonel Edward T. H. Warren of the 10th Virginia Infantry Regiment took command of the brigade. For unknown reasons, on September 11, 1862, Warren was ordered to stay with his regiment at Martinsburg. He and his regiment stayed here for the remainder of the campaign. Colonel James Washington Jackson of the 47th Alabama Infantry Regiment took command of the brigade after Warren. Jackson would command the brigade at Sharpsburg. At the time of the Maryland campaign, James Washington Jackson was 31 years old. Jackson was born in Meriwether, Georgia, and was raised in Gainesville. He first attended the Greensville Military Academy, but then set off to study medicine in New York. After he graduated from the University Medical College, he traveled back to Gainesville to establish his medical practice. He then relocated his practice to Lafayette, Alabama. When the war broke out, Jackson was made captain of Company A, 7th Alabama Infantry Regiment. Jackson was known to be a very sickly man, and in October of 1861 he returned home due to illness. In the spring of 1862, Jackson returned to the Army and sought a higher position in the 47th Alabama Infantry Regiment. Jackson was elected lieutenant colonel, with James M. Oliver as colonel. However, some men in the ranks grumbled about Jackson. They felt that Jackson was too sickly and too broken down for such a position of high responsibility. After the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August of 1862, Jackson was made colonel of the 47th Alabama Infantry Regiment after Colonel James M. Oliver resigned for unknown reasons. Jackson's brigade, according to Ezra Carman, at the time of the Maryland campaign was 500 men. The brigade consisted of the 23rd Virginia Infantry Regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Simeon T. Walton, the 37th Virginia Infantry Regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John F. Terry, the 47th Alabama Infantry Regiment commanded by Captain James M. Campbell, and the 48th Alabama Infantry under Colonel James L. Sheffield. The 10th Virginia Infantry Regiment under Warren was at Martinsburg during the battle and the rest of the campaign. The individual regimental strength for regiments in Starke's and Jackson's brigade is unknown, except for select regiments. The 10th Louisiana Infantry in Starke's brigade had an initial strength of 218 men, and the 23rd Virginia Infantry Regiment in Jackson's brigade had 120 men. However, this is all that's known about individual regimental strength. During the Maryland campaign, Starke's and Jackson's brigades were members of the famed Stonewall Division. The story of the Stonewall Division's commanders in 1862 is a lengthy one. The division was commanded by General Charles S. Winder during the 7 Days battle and Cedar Mountain, where he was killed. General William B. Taliaferro finished Cedar Mountain and commanded the division at Second Manassas, where he was wounded. Starke finished the battle, but for unknown reasons was replaced by General John Robert Jones. John Robert Jones was born in Harrisonburg, Virginia on March 12, 1827.
In his youth, Jones attended the Virginia Military Institute where he graduated with distinction. After his education, Jones became a teacher and ended up teaching at several different schools. When the war broke out, Jones organized a company that ended up being incorporated into the 33rd Virginia Infantry Regiment. Jones saw action at 1st Manassas as a captain in the regiment, but on August 21, 1861, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Although Jones gained favor with Stonewall Jackson, not all men felt the same way. In the spring of 1862, during regimental elections, Jones was lost the vote for colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major. However, Jones used his favor to his advantage with Jackson. With enough urging from Jackson, President Jefferson Davis promoted Jones to brigadier general and gave him command of a brigade in the Stonewall Division. Many promising colonels had been passed over for Jones, which angered many of the brigade officers greatly. Historian Robert K. Crick wrote, "Stonewall Jackson's numerous military virtues did not include an aptitude for identifying and nurturing promising subordinates. None was more disappointing than John Robert Jones." Jones's Stonewall Division was composed of 4 infantry brigades: Starke's Brigade, Jackson's Brigade, Colonel Andrew J. Grigsby's Stonewall Brigade, and Captain John E. Penn's Virginia Brigade. The division also had an artillery battalion made up of 6 artillery batteries commanded by Major Lindsay M. Shoemaker. The total strength of the division is something that can only be left up to speculation. Although Lieutenant Thomas Dunn, the acting adjutant of the Stonewall Division, estimated the division totaled 1,500 men, John R. Jones later stated that his division totaled 1,600 men in correspondence to Ezra Carman after the war. Either way, Jones's division crossed the Potomac River at White's Ford on September 5th, where it bivouacked near Three Springs, Maryland. On September 7th, the division reached Frederick, Maryland, and camped at the Best Farm, which is about a mile outside of the town. The division remained here until September 10th, when it continued marching to capture Harper's Ferry. The division marched to Williamsport, Maryland, where it recrossed the Potomac River and headed for Martinsburg, Virginia. The division reached Martinsburg on the 13th and quickly headed towards the Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry. The division reached Schoolhouse Ridge, about a mile west of the Federal defensive line on Bolivar Heights, either on the night of the 13th or the morning of the 14th. Starke's brigade was ordered to block the river road to prevent the Federals from making an escape. To the relief of the men in Jones's division, the Federal garrison under Dixon S. Miles surrendered at about 9 a.m. on the 15th of September. The division marched back to its camp at Halltown, Virginia, which is about 3 miles west of Harper's Ferry. Here the men prepared 2 days' rations and were quickly on the road to Sharpsburg by 1 a.m. The men of the famed Stonewall Division marched all night and crossed the Potomac River at sunrise on the 16th. The division reached the vicinity of Sharpsburg, Maryland, midday on the 16th. The men were allowed a 2-hour rest in a piece of woods a mile from Sharpsburg. One amusing incident during the campaign occurred when Jones's division reached Frederick, Maryland. A serious complaint came to Jackson that some brutes had committed brutal excesses and indecencies towards several young ladies in the city. The brutes were noted to be foreigners. Hearing this, Jackson immediately pointed fingers at Starke's Louisiana Brigade. This is because the Louisiana Brigade was filled with a range of varying nationalities, namely, the 10th Louisiana, known as Lee's Foreign Legion, contained men from Greece, Ireland, England, Scotland, Germany, Mexico, France, Italy, etc. Other units in the brigade, such as Coppen's battalion, were just as diverse. Jackson quickly made up his mind that the culprits were Starke's men and ordered Starke to march his brigade into the city so the brutes could be identified. Starke, in defense of his men and showing his leadership qualities, refused Jackson's order and demanded that a proper investigation be conducted. Jackson despised such refusal to obey orders and had Starke arrested. A proper investigation revealed, to what must have been Jackson's extreme embarrassment, that the brutes were not from Starke's brigade, but from the Grigsby Stonewall Brigade, which bears his name, fame, and pride. More importantly, this incident revealed that Starke had outstanding leadership qualities, and that he was willing to stand up and defend his men even if it meant his arrest. Starke was justly released from his arrest and was able to return to his brigade. After Hood's fight with Seymour's Pennsylvania bucktails in the East Woods, Jones's division was ordered to the Confederate left, where it formed in a double line. Jones positioned Grigsby's Stonewall Brigade with its right touching the Hagerstown Turnpike. Penn's brigade formed on the left at Grigsby, with its left touching the northernmost portion of the West Woods. The front line would be put in direct command of Colonel Grigsby. 210 yards in the rear of the first line were the brigades of Starke and Jackson. Both brigades lay in the wood line behind the fence of the north edge of the southern body of the West Woods. Jackson's brigade's right rested on the Hagerstown Turnpike. Starke's brigade was on their left, having their flank extend to the west edge of the West Woods. These two brigades would be under the direct command of General Starke. The regimental alignment of Starke's and Jackson's brigade is relatively unknown. The only regimental position that we know for sure is that the 1st Louisiana Infantry under Colonel Nolan was the extreme left regiment of Starke's brigade. We know this from letters between Captain W. E. Moore I and Ezra Carman. The content of these letters we will get into later. However, I do have my guesses when it comes to this subject. Based on the casualty reports for Starke and Jackson, it is somewhat safe to guess that the regiments that suffered the most casualties would be towards the left of the brigades. The exact numbers of said casualty reports and factors for why they would be on the left will be discussed later in the video. Based on this, from left to right, the alignment would be 1st Louisiana, 9th Louisiana, 2nd Louisiana, 10th Louisiana, and 15th Louisiana. In regards to Coppen's battalion, it is unknown as the casualties are not listed. However, renowned historian Scott Hartwick says in a superb Antietam study, I Dread the Thought of the Place, that Coppen's battalion was consolidated into the 1st Louisiana Regiment under Colonel Nolan. It is safe to assume that this is true, as the source listed for this is credible, and it makes sense that the casualty reports for Coppen's were not listed due to them being absorbed into the 1st Louisiana Infantry. If we apply the same theory to Jackson's brigade, the regimental alignment should be from left to right: 37th Virginia, 47th Alabama, 48th Alabama, and 23rd Virginia infantry regiments. There are also 3 artillery batteries from Shoemaker's battalion positioned with Jones's division. The Rockbridge Virginia Artillery, Pogue's battery, commanded by Captain William T. Pogue, was positioned in front of Grigsby's line. Pogue states in his report that, on the evening of the 16th, the battery consisting of 3 guns, 2 10-pounder Parrots, and 1 Napoleon, the 6-pounder being on detached service by order of General Jackson, was placed in position on or near the extreme left of our lines, supported by the 1st and 2nd Brigades. The battery engaged Simpson's and Ransom's Federal batteries at about 500 to 600 yard range. Poe continues, about 8 p.m., I was ordered to withdraw my guns a short distance in rear of the infantry, and to resume the same position by daylight the next morning. During the night, Poe ordered his 2 Parrott guns to be replaced by 2 howitzers from Captain Rain's Virginia battery. Brockenborough's Maryland battery, commanded by Captain John B. Brockenborough, runs in front of Stark's brigade and is angled diagonally across Stark's left flank. Brockenborough's battery consists of 6 guns, 1 3-inch ordnance rifle, 1 Blakely gun, 1 10-pounder Parrott, and 3 12-pounder howitzers. Apparently, Stark's Louisianians took several casualties around this time. Colonel Edmund Pendleton of the 15th Louisiana writes in his report, we encountered the shells from 3 of the enemy's batteries, and had the misfortune about dark through several of our own number, among whom was the gallant young Gordon, a lieutenant in the 9th Louisiana Regiment and acting assistant adjutant general of the brigade, who was killed by a shell which cut off both his legs at the thigh. It is also worthy to note that Pendleton writes that, even under the heaviest artillery fire, General Starke remained with the brigade constantly. The night of September 16, 1862 would have been a sleepless one. The division skirmishers were engaged all night, constantly waking up the sleeping men of Stark's and Jackson's brigades. The men of Jones's division were ordered to sleep on their arms. This means that they must be ready to rise up and fight at any moment. Men slept with their knapsacks and blanket rolls on, along with their accoutrements, haversack, and canteen, guns by their side. To make matters even worse, there was a drizzly rain that fell throughout the night. Colonel Pendleton recalls the sleepless night that, during the early part of the night, we were much disturbed by several of the enemy's batteries, which, crossing their fire, cut the treetops over our heads. The men of Starke and Jackson's brigades would have had a rude awakening near daylight on the morning of the 17th. Shells from Federal batteries positioned on higher ground in front and on the flanks across the Antietam would have rained upon the men of Jones's division. John H. Worsham of the 21st Virginia Infantry and Penn's Brigade recalls, we were not allowed to make much of an observation before the enemy's shells dropped in our midst from batteries in front and flank, and this soon became the fiercest artillery fire of the war. This duel between Federal batteries and Confederate artillery battalions soon became known as Artillery Hell. The artillery fire seemed to have a heavy impact on General Jones, who wrote, it was during this almost unprecedented iron storm that a shell exploded a little above my head and so stunned and injured me that I was rendered unfit for duty. This certainly does not make Jones' reputation any better, and some even speculate that Jones left the field out of cowardice. Whatever the reason, command of the division was turned over to General Starke. The command of Stark's brigade was most likely handed over to Colonel Williams of the 2nd Louisiana. However, it does seem from all the evidence that Starke remained near and in direct command of his brigade during this time. At around 5:30 a.m., Federal General Joseph Hooker's 1st Corps began advancing from their uncomfortable bivouacs at the Poffenberger Farm, through the North Woods, down the Hagerstown Turnpike, the Miller Farmstead, and into and around the infamous cornfield. The battle opened on the east side of the Hagerstown Turnpike. Fighting erupted around the East Woods when the right of Douglas's Georgia Brigade and Walker's Brigade engaged Seymour's Pennsylvania reserves. Next came Durier's New York and Pennsylvania Brigade, which advanced to the edge of the cornfield where a wall of lead met them from Douglas's Georgians. Under extreme pressure from Walker's Confederates, Seymour's Pennsylvanians retreat further into the East Woods. Duryea, who is nearly out of ammunition and has been locked in a desperate firefight, interprets this movement as a retreat and orders a withdrawal. As they retreat through Miller's cornfield, Duryea's men pass right by Hartstuff's brigade, which was ordered to support Duryea. Hartstuff is now advancing through the cornfield to take Duryea's place. At the same time, Hayes' Louisiana Brigade, who had been ordered by Lawton to support Douglas, moved from the West Woods to the right rear of Douglas. Hayes advances over Douglas's right and advances very near to the cornfield fence at the same moment Hartstuff appears from the corn. Both sides delivered intense fire and sustained heavy casualties. The left of Hartstuff flanks Hayes' right and delivers a devastating enfilade fire, which forces Hayes to retreat with great haste. Christian's brigade of Ricketts' division also made an appearance on Walker's right flank in the East Woods and forced him to retreat to his original line. The Federals advancing on Hooker's right through and around the Miller Farm were men under General Abner Doubleday's division. Leading the way is the famous Western Iron Brigade under General John Gibbon. The brigade has a total of 800 men present for duty on the morning of the 17th and was composed of 4 regiments hailing from Wisconsin and Indiana. These include the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas S. Allen, 6th Wisconsin under Lieutenant Colonel Edward S. Bragg, 7th Wisconsin under Captain John B. Callis, and the 19th Indiana under Lieutenant Colonel Alois O. Bachman. Moving forward in rear of the Iron Brigade was Colonel Walter Phelps Jr.'s brigade of about 450 men. His brigade consisted of the 2nd United States Sharpshooters under Colonel Henry A.V. Provost, the 22nd New York Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel John Mackay Jr., the 24th New York Infantry under Captain John D. O'Brien, the 30th New York Infantry under Colonel William M. Searing, and the 84th New York Infantry, more commonly known as the 14th Brooklyn or Red-Legged Devils, under Major William H. Debevoise. The Iron Brigade moved south along the Hagerstown Turnpike, with its left in the cornfield and its right extending slightly past the Hagerstown Turnpike. Gibbon must have known that Grigsby and Penn's Virginians were on his right, and in response he sent the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin west of the pike to flank and dislodge Jones' 2 meager frontline brigades. The 6th Wisconsin and 2nd Wisconsin continued to move forward through the cornfield. The right 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin were moving in the open field on the west side of the Hagerstown Turnpike, while the left 7 companies continued to move forward in the cornfield. Around this time, Captain Pogue's battery was threatened by the advance of the Iron Brigade. He wrote that, shortly after daylight on the morning of the 17th, the enemy's infantry commenced advancing. The 12-pounder under Lieutenant Brown, in conjunction with Captain Rain's howitzers, opened upon them, and after firing several rounds and finding themselves within the range of the enemy's skirmishers, retired to position in rear of our infantry. It is at this time that Penn's and Grigsby's brigades engaged the right companies of the 6th Wisconsin. The 2 brigades had been ordered to lie down for concealment from the dreadful artillery. When the Federals came in range, they were ordered to rise up and fire. Major Hazel J. Williams of the 5th Virginia and Grigsby's brigade recalled that, about 6 a.m., the advance column of the enemy approached our front, and the front line, which had been ordered to lie down for concealment, rose at the command of their intrepid leader and poured in a staggering volley, which stopped his advance. Captain Frank C. Wilson, who was commanding the 27th Virginia and Grigsby's brigades, similarly recalled that, at daylight the firing again commenced on our right, and in a short time our own skirmishers became engaged and withdrew, allowing the enemy to approach within sight, when we opened fire, causing them to retire. What Captain Wilson saw was the right 3 companies of the 6th Wisconsin fall back to the Hagerstown Turnpike fence. Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin writes about this movement.
The companies of the right wing received a deadly fire from the woods on their right. To save them, Colonel Bragg, with a quickness and coolness equal to the emergency, caused them to change front and form behind the turnpike fence, from whence they returned fire to the enemy.
Due to the intense musketry and artillery fire, Captain Pogue pulled his battery out of the line of fire and repositioned on a ridge just west of the West Woods. Brockenborough's battery followed Pogue to the same ridge. The left wing, commanded by Major Dawes, halted and lay down in the cornfield. Lieutenant Bragg was soon wounded by the fire from Penn and Grigsby. Command was turned over to Major Dawes. The 2nd Wisconsin under Lieutenant Colonel Allen was moving on the left of the 6th Wisconsin and advanced farther ahead of the 6th. Seeing this, Major Dawes ordered the left wing to rise up and move forward. Dawes sent Sergeant Major Howard J. Huntington to tell Captain Kellogg, who was commanding the companies on the pike after Bragg's wounding, to move the companies to the left and rejoin the left wing. Captain Kellogg deemed this impractical due to the severe musketry. At the same time, the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin, supported by the 21st New York and 35th New York of Marcina R. Patrick's brigade, were aiming for the vulnerable left flank of Grigsby's line. The 6th and 2nd Wisconsin continued to move forward through the cornfield until they reached the Virginia rail fence at the edge of the corn. What happened next was vividly recalled by Rufus Dawes. He writes that,
As we appeared at the edge of the corn, a long line of men in butternut and gray rose up from the ground. Simultaneously, the hostile battle lines opened a tremendous fire upon each other.
the Federals had stumbled upon the left regiments of Douglas's brigade and engaged in a very desperate firefight. Two 12-pound Napoleon guns under Lieutenant James Stewart were sent forward from Campbell's battery to a position about 200 yards from Grigsby's line. Stewart ordered his guns to be loaded with spherical case at 1 1/4 and 1 1/2 seconds, which soon began firing on Grigsby's men. The weight of Federal troops coming down to the cornfield began to tell upon Douglas's ranks, and his men began to fall back. On the left, extreme pressure is being added to the Grigsby's thin line. They were taking artillery fire from Stewart's section, musketry from the right, and were being flanked by the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin. A member of Stonewall Jackson's staff recalled the Federals' flanking movement, an apparent double battle line, moving toward us at charged bayonets, and the sunbeams falling on their well-polished guns. The situation for the two small Virginia brigades was becoming desperate. Colonel Grigsby saw the degrading situation and turned to a staff officer named Captain James M. Garnett, and said, "Go to General Starke, and tell him unless that I receive reinforcements I cannot hold this line much longer." Both Penn's and Grigsby's brigades began to capitulate under the pressure and began falling back to the reserve line. Although regiments like the 49th Virginia and Penn's brigade turned around and made stiff resistance, it could not stop the Federal tide. Captain Garnett hurried to find General Starke at the edge of the woods. He recalled this critical moment in his memoirs. "I hurried back to the edge of the woods, found General Starke. The words had barely escaped my lips when I saw the front line falling back and said to General Starke, 'There they are, coming back now, General.'" General Starke quickly seized the initiative and ordered his two brigades to rise to their feet. Starke waited for Penn's and Grigsby's panicked Virginians to fall back out of the way, then sprang to the front and led his two brigades forward in gallant style. Starke's Louisiana brigade was ordered to move at the right oblique, while for whatever reason Jackson's mixed Virginia and Alabama brigade initially moved straight forward. This caused the right of Starke's brigade to become mixed with Jackson's left, causing extreme confusion. Captain Garnett writes of the advance, "He immediately ordered the Louisiana and Taillefer's brigade to rise and move forward, which they did in gallant style at a right oblique, and he himself led them." As the two brigades crested the rise to their front, Starke would have seen the 6th and 2nd Wisconsin pursuing Douglas's broken Georgians on the east side of the pike, with a wild shout and rush. Seeing this, Starke would have naturally made the decision to change his front to the right to flank the Federal troops streaming out of the cornfield. However, changing the front of two brigades is an extremely difficult maneuver, especially under fire. As the Wisconsin men drove back the Georgians, they would have seen Starke's line of gray and butternut swarming out of the west woods, moving straight towards their right flank. Lieutenant Colonel Allen of the 2nd Wisconsin responded decisively and ordered his regiment to change front to the right, putting his line about 50 yards from the pike with his left running obliquely away from the pike. Dawes quickly ordered the 6th Wisconsin to join the right flank of the 2nd, positioning his line about 30 yards away from the pike with his left aligning on the right of the 2nd. Captain Kellogg, who took command of the right three companies, brought them up from the pike to form on the right of the 6th. The two Wisconsin regiments quickly began to shower Starke's men with a hail of musketry as they advanced. Starke's advancing line started to take tremendous casualties. Jackson recorded that they advanced under a heavy shower of grape shot, bomb shells, and musket balls. Captain Richard B. Jennings of the 23rd Virginia recalled that the Federals just mowed us down. The heavy shower of projectiles would have made it nearly impossible for the two rebel brigades to right wheel and change front in some semblance of order. Men were falling at each step, shouting and yelling. Starke's once neat battle lines would have deformed into a disorganized, irregular charging line of yelling men. Some men would have been loading and firing as they rushed on. The men would have been looked like they were advancing against a strong wind, only this wind is deadly. As Starke's men emerged from the west woods, Lieutenant Stewart, who had been ordered to move his two guns forward to engage Grigsby, was once again ordered forward. He was ordered forward by Lieutenant Frank Haskell of Gibbon's staff and relayed orders to move forward 100 yards to a slight ridge which offered a better range of fire. Although questioning the order, Stewart limbered his two guns and moved forward at a dead run. Stewart left his limbers behind straw stacks south of the Miller barn for protection. It immediately unlimbered his guns and began sending shots into the advancing line. It was around this time of the Wheeling movement when the tragic mortal wounding of General Starke occurred. General Starke was on foot and gallantly leading his 2 brigades when he was struck by 3 Minié balls and fell mortally wounded. Captain William E. Moore of the 1st Louisiana wrote to Ezra Carman that General Starke was on foot and was in advance of the wavering line. Our brigade pressed on to the fence, leaving General Starke uncovered. General Starke would be taken to the rear where he would die within the hour. The exact place where General Starke was shot will never be known exactly, but Ezra Carman states that he was gunned down 160 yards north of the West Woods and 140 yards west of the road. The death of General Starke only added to the confusion of the advance. Even then, the determined Louisianians, Virginians, and Alabamians continued to advance towards the pike. The Federal infantry on the east side of the pike continued to pour a devastating fire into the desperate advancing line of Confederates. After a grueling advance, Stark's disorganized line collided with a 6-rail-high post-and-rail fence that borders the Hagerstown Turnpike. These types of fences cannot be torn down easily and completely stopped the rebel advance. The Louisianians, Virginians, and Alabamians immediately took what cover they could behind the fence and began to return fire. Colonel Pendleton of the 15th Louisiana vividly recalls the spectacle. Still, we charged forward in the face of a murderous fire, which thinned our ranks at every step, until our progress was arrested by a lane, on either side of which was a high, staked fence stretching along our whole front, to pass which, under the circumstances, was an impossibility. Colonel Jackson similarly recalled, I charged them up to a form in about 50 yards of the enemy. As soon as they got to the fence, they all fell down and began firing. The strong post and rail fence was impossible to pass. Under the intense fire, the lane in between the 2 fences would have been no man's land. Meanwhile, Phelps Jr.'s brigade had moved up to within 25 yards in the rear of Gibbon. Seeing that the right of Stark's line could extend past the right flank of the 6th Wisconsin, Phelps ordered the 14th Brooklyn forward. Major William Debevoise rushed the 14th forward and merged his ranks with the 6th Wisconsin. The New Yorkers filled the awful gaps left by Stark's bullets and immediately returned fire. Major Dawes recalled,
Now is the pinch. Men and officers of New York and Wisconsin are fused into a common mass in the frantic struggle to shoot fast.
The firing all along the rebel and Federal line was super intense. Major Dawes continues to write,
Every body tears cartridges, loads, passes guns, or shoots. Men are falling in their places or running back into the corn. The soldier who is shooting is furious in his energy. The soldier who is shot looks around for help with an imploring agony of death on his face.
As shown by Dawes, the Federal line is taking enormous casualties just like their Confederate counterparts. This high casualty rate and intense rebel fire forces the 6th Wisconsin and 14th Brooklyn to give way. Dawes recalled this moment.
After a few rods of advance, the line stopped and, by common impulse, fell back to the edge of the corn and laid down on the ground behind the low rail fence.
Fortunately for the Federals, as the Wisconsin and Brooklyn men were falling back to the corn, Colonel Phelps ordered the 2nd United States sharpshooters to move forward. The sharpshooters moved forward in line and changed front to the right to meet Starke. Colonel Post maneuvered his line to where the right was on the east turnpike fence and left slightly obliquing away from the pike. With this encouragement, the 6th and 14th Brooklyn rallied and formed on the left of the 2nd United States sharpshooters, resuming their fire. Seeing the Federals momentarily fall back, some Confederates began to climb the fence, but were soon gunned down by the sharpshooters in the 2nd Wisconsin, which stayed firm. Once the 6th and 14th regained their position, the fire became even deadlier. Multiple attempts were made to get Stark's and Jackson's men to move forward, but the deadly fire and high fence made it an impossibility. Colonel Jackson wrote, I made every effort to make them charge over the fence, but the fire was so destructive that they would not rise. Captain Richard P. Jennings of the 23rd Virginia recalled the deadly fire. I laid down by the lieutenant and Captain Thomas S. Michaels on the other side of a large old stump. There was a corporal of some other company standing up by the stump loading and firing, and we tried to get him to lie down. Soon, a ball passed over my legs, which I had down close to the ground, and went through the lieutenant's knees. And soon after, a shot struck Captain Michaels on the ankle. And then the corporal was shot dead and fell right over us. And as he dropped his hands, he scratched me in the face. And I said to Captain Michaels, I am going out from here. And he said, Do not try it, Captain. You will be killed before you can reach the timber. The fire was so intense it was nearly impossible to bring wounded off the field. In Company B, 6th Wisconsin, a private was shot and cried out to his captain, Roland P. Converse, "Captain, Captain, I am killed, I am killed." Converse coldly responded, "Go to the rear then." It was most likely around this time when Colonel Jesse Williams of the 2nd Louisiana was severely wounded when a Minay ball struck his chest. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Nolan, commanding the 1st Louisiana, was also wounded seriously in the leg during the intense fighting. This left Captain W. E. Moore in the command of the 1st Louisiana and nearly 10 minutes of the Gray Line reaching the west side of the pike. Colonel Edmund Pendleton of the 15th Louisiana was also slightly wounded by a contusion in the foot caused by a spherical case which passed between his feet. To make matters worse for Stark's men, Stewart's section continued to fire a spherical case directly down the flank of the 1st Louisiana. The artillery tore men in half, sent them high in the air with fence rails, knapsacks, and other debris. When Stark's men were advancing out of the West Woods and Stewart's section came at a dead run to get into position, the 135 men of the 80th New York, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore B. Gates, rushed up in support of Stewart's section. The right wing was in direct support of the guns while the left wing poured shots into Stark's left flank. The situation was about to deteriorate even further for Stark's men. As stated before, the 19th Indiana, 7th Wisconsin, 21st New York, and 35th New York had been sent to the west side of the Hagerstown Turnpike to hit the left flank of Penn and Grigsby. The Federal flanking column had been approaching the northern body of the West Woods as Stark's line engaged in the desperate firefight on the pike. The 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin halted their advance, with the 7th Wisconsin on a rock ledge and the 19th Indiana extending into the West Woods. The 21st New York and 35th New York continued to stay in the rear of the two frontline regiments. The scene the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin stumbled upon must have been appalling. About 175 yards to the front, they would have seen the backs of Stark's men as they desperately took cover on the turnpike fence. The 19th and 7th lost no time and immediately opened fire into the rear of Stark's men. The Hoosiers and Wisconsin men showed no mercy to Stark's men and gunned down a few that were trying to surrender. Private Hugh Perkins of the 7th Wisconsin vividly recalled these brutal moments. "We were brought up in the rear of a rebel brigade, laid in the woods, fired 20 rounds before we were discovered, piling them in heaps as they lay behind a fence. After they discovered our position, well, they threw down their arms and broke for the woods, what was left of them. Then we had fun picking them off. We might have taken them all prisoners, but we wasn't in for that. Even a wounded man cannot be seen creeping off without being plugged by a Minay ball." Realizing their predicament, panic spread like a wildfire within Stark's wavering line. Stark's line was surrounded on three sides. They were taking fire from the front, artillery shots from their left, and fierce musketry from their rear. It was too much for the Louisianians, Virginians, and Alabamians to handle. Stark's line melted away, and the survivors fled for the West Woods. The left side of Stark's line took the heaviest fire from the rear, meaning that side of the line probably gave way first and with the most panic, while the extreme right of the Stark's line, the 15th Louisiana, and the rest of Jackson's brigade got off with some but little semblance of order. Colonel Edmund Pendleton of the 15th Louisiana recalled the retreat, the men withdrawing in tolerable order and fighting as they fell back. Captain Richard P. Jennings of the 23rd Virginia and Jackson's brigade had a different story. He said, "I said I had as well be killed running as lying still, so I got up, and the balls flew around me like a swarm of bees, and I just let out and ran like a deer. It made it to the timber, but I was almost scared to death when I got there." The sharpshooters lost no time gunning down Stark's retreating men. William H. Humphrey of the 2nd United States Sharpshooters gruesomely recalled, "It seemed to me as though every bullet hit the mark. They could stand no longer and face our bullets, and they broke for the woods. And as they ran up the hill, it looked to me as though they went on all fours as our bullets would strike them. They would turn a complete somersault and lay down. To react, our boys would cheer, see they cry, see the dust fly out of their clothing as our bullets struck them." Stark's line would have disintegrated in seconds at the realization that they were surrounded on three sides. The scene would have been one of extreme panic. Confederates thrown down their guns and taken flight at full speed to the woods. Others would have been shot down as they desperately tried to escape. Major Dawes described the scene in his memoirs.
Forward is the word. The men are loading and firing with demoniacal fury and shouting and laughing hysterically, and the whole field before us is covered with rebels fleeing for life into the woods.
The Wisconsin men began to press Stark's men harder and began to move forward. There was no time for Stark's men to bring off the wounded along the fence. In fact, Colonel Williams of the 2nd Louisiana was captured after he was rendered incapacitated by his chest wound. As Stark's line melted, the color bearer of the 1st Louisiana was killed at the fence. The colors dropped over the fence and into the road. Adjutant Lewis C. Parmalee and others of the 2nd United States Sharpshooters rushed forward into the road to seize the colors. Some of Stark's retreating men must have seen this, turned and opened fire, killing Parmalee. The sharpshooters were able to get the captured rebel flag into their lines without any more casualties. Those who were not shot down running the gauntlet to the west woods quickly rallied under Colonel Stafford, who had brigade command devolved upon him due to the death of Starke and wounding of Williams. The remnants of Stark's and Jackson's brigades formed with the remnants of the rest of John R. Jones's division. Meanwhile, deeper in the west woods, near the Dunker Church, Hood's division formed for a counterattack. Hood's 2 brigades, the famed Texas Brigade commanded by William Wofford, and Law's brigade commanded by Evander Law, burst out of the west woods around the Dunker Church and immediately drove back the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin, along with the sharpshooters and Phelps Brigade back through the cornfield. The left 3 regiments of Wofford's brigade were ordered to change their front to the left to face Stewart's section, which poured canister into the advancing rebels. The rebels aligned on the turnpike fence and immediately opened fire on Stewart's section. At the same time, Law's brigade angled towards the southeast corner of the cornfield. Hood, like Stark, did not see the 7th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana. The Wisconsin men and Hoosiers, along with the 2 New York regiments from Patrick's brigade, began to advance towards the Hagerstown Turnpike to attack Wofford's left 3 regiments. After exchanging shots, the Federals charged into the turnpike, driving back the 3 rebel regiments. The remnants of Stark's brigade, along with the remnants of Jones's division, could not resist attacking the 19th Indiana's exposed flank near the turnpike. The Louisianians, Virginians, and Alabamians advanced out of the west woods and delivered a heavy fire into the Federal flank. The 35th New York, 21st New York, and 19th Indiana changed front to meet Jones' desperate counterattack, and drove Jones' men back into the west woods. This was a short-lived second charge of Jones's division. This was the last action of Stark's and Jackson's brigades of the day. Stark's brigade was only called out once more to support a battery later in the day. In this, Colonel Stafford received a severe contusion on the foot from a shell, putting Colonel Edmund Pendleton in charge of the brigade. The day's slaughter for Stark's and Jackson's brigades was over, although they paid a very heavy price. The whole debacle on the fence lasted only 15 to 30 minutes. In that short window of time, 300 of the 650 men of Stark's brigade were killed, wounded, or captured. Those casualties included the gallant General Stark, Colonel Williams, Colonel Pendleton, Colonel Nolan, and Colonel Stafford. Pendleton even goes on to say that not a single officer in the brigade escaped without some sort of wound. The regimental casualty numbers for Stark's brigade are found in Colonel Stafford's report and are as follows. 1st Louisiana took 71 casualties with Lieutenant R.P. Cates killed. 2nd Louisiana took 62 casualties with Lieutenants Hobart McBride and M.V.B. Swan killed. 9th Louisiana took 82 casualties with Captain Grigsby and Lieutenants Henderson and Robinson killed. 10th Louisiana took 57 casualties with Lieutenant Alexander killed, and the 15th Louisiana took 15 casualties with no officers killed. Now back to the regimental alignment based on casualties. It's safe to say that the left wing of Stark's brigade took the most casualties compared to the right wing regiments. This is with the exception of the 1st Louisiana, which was confirmed by W.E. Moore to be the extreme left regiment. This is probably due to several factors. The Federal line was at a closer distance to the left-wing regiments than any other part of the rebel line. Secondly, Stewart's section would have most likely hit the left regiments the most. And finally, the line of sight for the 19th Indiana and 7th Wisconsin would have been directly on the left regiments of Stark's brigade. Therefore, more fire would have been put on that section of the line. Jackson's brigade took 170 casualties out of 500 men, including Colonel Jackson, who was wounded when a ball struck his right arm, Lieutenant Colonel John F. Terry of the 37th Virginia, who was severely wounded in the wrist, and Lieutenant Colonel Simeon T. Walton, who was wounded during the intense fighting as well. The regimental casualty numbers for Jackson's brigade are as follows. The 47th Alabama took 45 casualties with Lieutenant George W. Gamel killed. 48th Alabama took 42 casualties with Captain R.C. Golightly killed. 23rd Virginia took 38 casualties with Lieutenant W.J. Sims killed. 37th Virginia took 48 casualties with officers Hordenstein, McHagee, Rea, and Wallen killed. The full list of men by name killed, wounded, or captured for Stark's and Jackson's brigades are on Antietam on the web. I'll provide a link in the description below. The aftermath along the Hagerstown Turnpike was simply horrendous. Major Dawes recalled the tragic scene.
The piles of dead on the Sharpsburg and Hagerstown Turnpike surpassed anything on any other battlefield of my observation. My feeling was that the Antietam Turnpike surpassed all in manifest evidence of slaughter.
Dawes continues.
As I rode through the narrow lane made by piling the bodies along beside the turnpike fences, I trembled in every limb with fright and was wet with perspiration. Friend and foe were indiscriminately mingled.
George F. Noyes, a member of Doubleday staff, recalled the brutal aftermath. And so it was on the other side of the turnpike, nay, in the turnpike itself, ride where we may, through the cornfield, wood, or ravine, and our ride will be among the dead until the heart grows sick and faint with horror. Around 470 dead and wounded of Stark's and Jackson's brigades would have been piled on top of each other in a line spanning around 200 yards along the turnpike fence. Simply a horrendous sight. The impact of the sacrifice and the price that the men of Stark's and Jackson's brigades paid is bigger than just during the battle, but had a lasting impact on our society and the way we view war. 2 days after the battle, on September 19, 1862, a photographer named Alexander Gardner would ride through the area with the goal of documenting human carnage. 5 existing photographs remain from the aftermath along the Hagerstown Turnpike. These photographs show the dead of Stark's Louisiana Brigade where they fell. One of these photographs is labeled View on Battlefield, Group of Louisiana Regiment as they fell at Battle of Antietam. Mangled bodies litter all along the turnpike fence. If you look closely, you can make out uniform items, blankets, gear strewn all over the ground, and even a Louisianian who was cut in half. These images were taken 2 days after the burial process had begun, meaning that, initially after the fight, there would have been significantly more bodies than shown in these images. It is not known what specific regiment these men belonged to, but it looks like the left of Stark's line because you can see the end of the line of dead men, so probably either 1st or 9th Louisiana. These images were displayed in northern cities and shook the public. In response to the showing of Brady's exhibit titled The Dead of Antietam, a New York Times reviewer stated, Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it. You will see hushed, reverent groups standing around these weird copies of carnage, bending down to look in the pale faces of the dead, chained by the strange spell that dwells in a dead man's eyes. I have a personal connection to Stark's brigade in this battle. In the thin ranks of the 2nd Louisiana, there was an 18-year-old named James Seth Scarborough. He would escape Antietam unhurt, but his luck would run out at Gettysburg, and he would be killed. James is a relative of mine, and I have taken it upon myself to tell the overshadowed story of the 2nd Louisiana Brigade of the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, there y'all have it. The story of one of the most overshadowed fights during Antietam is told in detail. This video is not only in tribute to the forgotten men of Stark's and Jackson's brigades, but also to the forgotten Federal men who also suffered as a result of this engagement, in a war over money. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thanks.